The diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge lived up to its name in the most literal sense, existing in the tenuous space between human and Elthari territories, where neither side could claim absolute authority. David Okonkwo stood in one of the ship's observation lounges, reviewing his notes on a data pad while trying to manage the anxiety that had been his constant companion since this assignment began 3 weeks ago. He was a cultural attaché, which was a diplomatic way of saying he was the person responsible for making sure humanity's negotiation team didn't accidentally insult their Elthari counterparts through ignorance of customs and protocols. It was a position that sounded more prestigious than it felt, especially given that David's expertise was entirely academic. He'd studied Elthari history and culture at university, written his doctoral thesis on pre-imperial Elthari governance structures, and somehow that had qualified him for this high-stakes diplomatic mission despite having never actually met an Elthari person before last month. The negotiations themselves were going reasonably well, all things considered. After years of Cold War tension following border disputes and mutual suspicion, both sides seemed genuinely committed to finding peaceful resolution. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Sarah Chen, a career diplomat with decades of experience in complicated negotiations. The Elthari delegation was led by Queen Ashara Vasthel herself, which had surprised everyone. Most had expected her to send representatives rather than personally overseeing talks with a species her empire had been in conflict with. Queen Ashara was young for a sovereign ruler, only 35 years old, having ascended to the throne 5 years ago following her mother's death. In those 5 years, she'd consolidated power with ruthless efficiency, eliminated internal opposition to her rule, and established herself as a force to be reckoned with in Elthari imperial politics. She was brilliant, calculating, and according to intelligence reports, feared by her own advisors as much as by potential enemies. David had read everything available about her, academic analyses of her political maneuvering, intelligence assessments of her strategic thinking, even some cultural commentary about her impact on modern Elthari society. But none of that had prepared him for meeting her in person. The first time he'd seen Queen Ashara during the formal reception 3 days ago, David's brain had essentially short-circuited. He didn't have adequate words. Beautiful was insufficient. Striking was closer but still missed something essential. She had the characteristic Elthari features, the long ears that tracked sound with predatory precision, the elegant bone structure, the dark eyes that seemed to see through any pretense. But on her they combined into something that made David's professional composure dissolve into awkward stammering. She was tall, moving with the unconscious grace that came from lifetime combat training, wearing formal regalia that somehow managed to be both elegant and intimidating. When she'd entered the reception hall, conversations had died and people had reflexively stepped back, creating space around her that spoke to the authority she commanded. David had immediately looked away and hadn't looked back, because according to his research, prolonged eye contact with Elthari royalty was considered a challenge to their authority, a breach of protocol that could have serious diplomatic consequences. So he'd carefully maintained his gaze somewhere around her shoulder or collarbone whenever she was present, speaking when addressed but never meeting her eyes directly. What David didn't realize was that his research was based on protocols from approximately 200 years ago that had evolved significantly in modern Elthari culture. Contemporary Elthari society still maintained hierarchical formality, but the specific eye contact protocols had relaxed considerably. Looking at royalty while being addressed was now expected as a sign of honest engagement rather than forbidden as presumptuous challenge. So from Queen Ashara's perspective, this human cultural attaché was deliberately refusing to look at her, which struck her as either profound disrespect or profound fear, and she couldn't determine which was more insulting. Attaché Okonkwo, A voice interrupted David's nervous review of his notes. He looked up to find Ambassador Chen approaching, her expression carrying the kind of diplomatic neutrality that usually meant something was wrong. "The Queen has requested your presence at this afternoon session. She wants your input on historical precedents for the territorial boundary discussions." "Of course," David replied, trying to sound professionally confident rather than anxious. "I've prepared notes on the pre-imperial border treaties that might provide useful frameworks." "Good," Chen said, but she didn't leave immediately, studying David with the assessing gaze that made her such an effective negotiator. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you done something to offend Queen Ashara personally?" David felt his stomach drop. "What? No, I mean not intentionally, have I?" "Her advisors have been making comments about human disrespect, specifically mentioning you by name," Chen said carefully. "I can't get clear answers about what the actual offense is, but it's creating tension that's complicating the negotiations. If you've inadvertently violated some protocol, I need to know so we can address it." "I've been following proper protocols as outlined in Ilthari cultural guidelines," David said, probably too defensively. "I've been careful about maintaining appropriate distance, using correct forms of address, avoiding anything that could be interpreted as—" "David," Chen interrupted gently, "can you look at me and tell me honestly that you haven't noticed any particular tension with the Queen?" David met the ambassador's eyes and realized he'd been avoiding thinking about this precise question. "She seems angry. But I thought that was just her general demeanor. The reports said she's intimidating and doesn't tolerate incompetence." "She's not angry at everyone," Chen pointed out. "She's been perfectly cordial with the rest of our team. But with you specifically, there's something off, and whatever it is, it's starting to affect the broader negotiations." She paused. "I need you to figure out what's wrong and fix it. We're too close to a breakthrough to let interpersonal issues derail everything." After Chen left, David spent the next 2 hours obsessively reviewing everything he knew about Ilthari royal protocol, looking for any possible mistake he might have made. He found nothing obvious. He'd been following the guidelines exactly as written in his source materials. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe his sources were outdated or incomplete. Maybe modern Ilthari customs had evolved beyond what he'd learned in academic settings. By the time the afternoon negotiation session convened, David had worked himself into a state of professional dread. He entered the conference room with carefully prepared notes, took his designated seat at the human delegations table, and absolutely did not look at Queen Ashara, who sat at the head of the Ilthari delegations table in a position that commanded the entire space. The session began with discussions of territorial boundaries, reviewing proposals and counter-proposals that had been developing over the past week. David listened carefully, waiting for the historical context questions that Chen had mentioned. When they came, he provided his prepared input about pre-imperial treaty frameworks, delivering the information clearly and professionally, while looking at the holographic star charts projected in the center of the table, rather than at the Queen he was ostensibly addressing. "Attaché à conquo," Queen Ashara's voice cut through his explanation, and David felt every muscle in his body tense at the controlled intensity in her tone. "You're describing treaties from the Shalara dynasty period. Would you care to explain why human territorial claims bear any relationship to agreements made between Ilthari clans 800 years ago?" It wasn't a genuine question. It was a test, a challenge to his expertise framed as professional inquiry. David knew the answer immediately because he'd anticipated this exact objection. The Shalara dynasty treaties established precedents for how territorial boundaries could be negotiated between parties with fundamentally different conceptions of ownership and sovereignty, he explained, pulling up relevant data on his pad while continuing to carefully not look directly at Queen Ashara. Humans and Ilthari have similarly divergent cultural frameworks around territorial control. The Shalara precedents provide established diplomatic language that both sides can reference without requiring either to abandon their foundational concepts. He was looking at his data pad while he spoke, then at the holographic displays, then at Ambassador Chen, anywhere but at the Queen. He could feel her watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle with awareness, but looking directly at her felt impossible, not because of protocol now, but because he knew if he met her eyes, he would lose his entire train of thought and probably start babbling like an idiot. An adequate explanation, Queen Ashara said, her voice carrying an edge that David couldn't quite interpret. Though I note you seem to find the star charts more worthy of your attention than the people you're addressing. There was a pause in the room, the kind of terrible silence that meant everyone had noticed the tension, but no one wanted to acknowledge it directly. David felt his face heating up, but kept his eyes fixed on his data pad. My apologies if my presentation style is insufficient, Your Majesty. I intended no offense. Another pause, even more uncomfortable than the first. Then Queen Ashara spoke again, her voice perfectly controlled but somehow conveying displeasure that made David want to sink through the floor. We'll take a 30-minute recess. Attaché Okonkwo, I require a private conversation. Everyone else dismissed. The room emptied with efficient speed, both delegations clearly relieved to escape the tension. Ambassador Chen gave David a look that was equal parts sympathy and concern as she left, leaving him alone with Queen Ashara and the absolute certainty that he'd managed to catastrophically screw up his first major diplomatic assignment. Queen Ashara stood, moving around the table with that same predatory grace David had noticed during the reception, positioning herself between David and the door in a way that wasn't quite aggressive, but definitely blocked his most obvious escape route. David remained seated because standing would require moving closer to her, and his brain was already struggling with proximity management. Attaché Okonkwo, Queen Ashara said, and her voice was quieter now but somehow more dangerous. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Why won't you look at me? David's mind raced through possible responses, discarding options that sounded too weak or too presumptuous or too honest. I've been following proper cultural protocols as I understand them, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect. You've been following protocols that were outdated when my grandmother ruled, Queen Ashara replied, and there was genuine anger in her voice now, breaking through her sovereign control. Modern Elthari culture expects direct eye contact during formal conversations. Your continued avoidance of looking at me is read as either fear or contempt, and I can't determine which is more insulting. David started, finally looking up and immediately regretting it because Queen Ashara was right there, close enough that he could see the complex patterns in her eyes, the slight flush of color in her face that indicated strong emotion. His brain stuttered over whatever he'd been about to say, losing the thread completely. There, Queen Ashara said, and something in her expression shifted. You looked at me for approximately 2 seconds before your gaze fled to the wall behind me. Why, what offense have I caused that merits this level of deliberate avoidance? You haven't caused any offense, David managed, fighting the urge to look away again because she just explained that was precisely the wrong response. I swear, Your Majesty, you've done nothing wrong. This is entirely my failing. Then explain it to me, Queen Ashara demanded, and underneath the command David heard something that might have been hurt. Explain why you can interact normally with every other member of my delegation, but cannot bring yourself to look at me directly. My advisors believe you're deliberately insulting me as some kind of political statement. I need to know if that's true. It's not true, David said, probably too loudly, his professional composure completely dissolving under the intensity of her attention. I would never deliberately insult you. You're brilliant and intimidating, and I'm terrified of making mistakes that could jeopardize these negotiations and... He stopped himself, but too late. Queen Ashara's expression had shifted again, the anger fading into something more complicated. "You find me intimidating," she said slowly, like she was testing the words. "Is that why you won't look at me? Because you fear me?" "Not exactly," David said miserably, aware he'd already said too much but apparently unable to stop himself from making it worse. "I mean, yes, you're intimidating because you're a sovereign ruler with absolute authority over an empire and the power to end these negotiations with a word. But that's not why I can't look at you." "Then why?" Queen Ashara pressed, and she'd moved closer without David noticing, close enough now that he could smell whatever subtle scent she wore, something that reminded him of night-blooming flowers. David knew he should make up a diplomatic excuse, something professional and face-saving that would resolve this without creating additional complications. But he was exhausted and overwhelmed, and she was so close that his brain had basically stopped functioning in any useful capacity. The truth came out before he could stop it. "Because you're overwhelming beautiful, Your Majesty, and every time I try to look at you directly, I lose my ability to think coherently, which seems like a terrible liability for someone whose job is to provide clear diplomatic advice. So I've been avoiding looking at you because that seemed like the only way to remain professional. But apparently that was exactly the wrong approach, and I've just been making everything worse through cultural incompetence and general awkwardness." The silence that followed his mortifying confession was absolute and excruciating. David stared at the floor, waiting for, he didn't know what, diplomatic incident, professional dismissal, possibly imprisonment for insulting a sovereign ruler through inappropriate personal comments. What? Queen Ashara's voice was barely a whisper, all the commanding authority completely absent. "What did you just say?" "I apologize, Your Majesty," David said desperately. "That was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. I'll submit my resignation from this mission immediately and accept whatever consequences." "You think I'm beautiful?" David risked looking up and immediately regretted it because Queen Ashara's expression was unlike anything he'd seen from her before. The cold control was gone, replaced by something almost vulnerable, like his confession had cracked through careful armor to reveal someone underneath who didn't know how to process what she'd just heard. Yes," David managed. "Obviously. I mean, you're objectively beautiful. Stunning, actually. I assume everyone thinks that, but they're better at maintaining professional composure than I apparently am." "No one has ever told me I'm beautiful," Queen Ashara said quietly, and she sounded stunned, like he'd just said something impossible. "I'm a sovereign ruler. I'm feared and respected and obeyed." "No one has ever," she stopped, visibly collecting herself, but her hands were trembling slightly where they gripped her formal robes. David felt like he'd somehow stumbled into even more dangerous territory than before. "I'm sorry if I've overstepped. I genuinely didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You haven't made me uncomfortable," Queen Ashara said, and now she sounded almost bewildered. "You've made me, I don't know. No one has looked at me the way you're looking at me now. Not in 5 years as queen, possibly not ever." "How am I looking at you?" David asked, then immediately regretted the question because it required him to maintain eye contact while she answered. And maintaining eye contact with Queen Ashara while she was looking back at him with that vulnerable expression was doing absolutely devastating things to his ability to breathe normally. "Like I'm a person rather than a crown," Queen Ashara replied. "Like you see Ashara rather than Queen Ashara-Vasthel. It's unusual." She paused, seeming to struggle with something internal, and rather overwhelming if I'm being honest. They stood in charged silence, neither quite sure what to do with this unexpected confession from opposite directions. Finally, Queen Ashara spoke again, her voice regaining some of its command but remaining softer than her usual formal tone. "I need to return to my delegation and provide an explanation for this recess. You need to return to your delegation and prepare for the remainder of today's session." "But David," she used his given name for the first time, and hearing it in her voice did unfortunate things to his cardiovascular system. When you participate in the remainder of negotiations, I expect you to look at me properly. Modern Ilthari protocol requires direct eye contact during professional exchanges. Can you manage that? I'll try, Your Majesty, David said, though his internal certainty that he'd be able to maintain professional coherence while looking at her properly was somewhere near zero. Good, Queen Ashara said. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him with an expression that was complicated and unguarded, and did absolutely nothing to help David's ability to think clearly. And David, thank you for being honest with me. Even if your timing was absolutely terrible and your delivery needed significant work. She left before he could formulate a response, and David collapsed into the nearest chair, putting his head in his hands and trying to process what had just happened. He'd confessed his attraction to a sovereign queen during diplomatic negotiations. He'd told her she was beautiful in tones of professional frustration. He'd somehow cracked through her careful armor to the person underneath, and she'd looked at him like he'd given her something precious. This was either the worst mistake of his career or the beginning of something he didn't have words for yet. Possibly both. The remainder of that aware of the way her expressions shifted when she was considering arguments, how her ears tilted forward when something interested her, the focused intelligence in her eyes that made him understand why her advisors respected and feared her in equal measure. Queen Ashara, for her part, seemed different after their private conversation, less coldly controlled, more visibly engaged with the discussions. David noticed her watching him when she thought he was focused on other things, and whenever their eyes met, there was something in her expression that suggested she was still processing his earlier confession. The negotiations themselves progressed well. David's historical frameworks actually proved useful in breaking through an impasse over territorial designation, providing language that both sides could accept without requiring either to abandon their fundamental positions. By the time the session concluded, Ambassador Chen looked cautiously optimistic, and even the Ilthari advisors seemed less hostile toward the human delegation. As everyone filed out of the conference room, Queen Ashara made a gesture to one of her advisors, and David found himself being approached by a tall Ilthari woman in formal court attire. Attaché à Conquo, Her Majesty requests your presence for a private dinner this evening to discuss cultural protocols in detail. She believes addressing the miscommunication issues between your delegation and ours would be beneficial for the ongoing negotiations. It was phrased as a diplomatic necessity, but David strongly suspected that whatever Queen Ashara wanted to discuss, it went beyond formal cultural protocols. Of course, he agreed, because refusing a royal summons seemed like a poor diplomatic choice. What time and location? Her Majesty's private dining room, 1900 hours. I'll send you directions. David spent the intervening hours alternating between reviewing notes on Ilthari culture and trying not to panic about having a private dinner with Queen Ashara. He changed his shirt 3 times, then felt ridiculous about carrying what he wore to what was ostensibly a professional meeting. Finally settling on something appropriately formal but not pretentiously so, he made his way through Harmony's Edge's corridors to the Ilthari delegation section. Queen Ashara's private dining room was surprisingly understated compared to the formal grandeur of the negotiation spaces. Comfortable furniture, warm lighting, a table sized for intimate conversation rather than diplomatic ceremony. Queen Ashara herself had changed from her formal regalia into something more casual, though even her informal attire was elegant and clearly expensive. She dismissed the staff member who'd escorted David, leaving them alone in the quiet space. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," Queen Ashara said, gesturing for David to sit. "I hope you understand that this conversation needs to remain private, not secret, but not something to be formally reported to our respective delegations either." "I understand," David replied, taking the offered seat and trying to project professional composure he absolutely didn't feel. "I've spent the afternoon thinking about our earlier conversation," Queen Ashara continued, pouring what looked like Elthari wine into 2 glasses with practiced elegance. "Specifically, I've been trying to understand why your confession affected me so strongly." David accepted the wine glass she offered, grateful for something to do with his hands. "I apologize again for the inappropriate timing and delivery of that confession. It was unprofessional." "It was honest," Queen Ashara corrected, "which is rare enough in my position that I'm still not entirely sure how to process it." She took a sip of her wine, studying him over the rim of her glass. "Do you know what it's like to be feared by everyone around you? To have people either obey you because they must or flatter you because they want something?" "I can't imagine," David admitted. "That sounds isolating." "It is," Queen Ashara said quietly. "I've been queen for 5 years. In that time, no one has dared to tell me anything that wasn't either a formal report or calculated flattery. My advisors fear my displeasure. My court fears my authority. Even my family treats me as a sovereign rather than a person." She paused. "And then you, a human cultural attaché on his first diplomatic assignment, refuse to look at me for days because you find me too beautiful to think around. It's possibly the most genuine thing anyone has said to me since I took the throne." "I still think my delivery needed work," David said, aiming for light humor to cut through the tension. Queen Ashara's lips curved into something that might have been an actual smile. "Your delivery was terrible. You sounded offended that I was attractive, like it was an inconvenience you hadn't planned for." "It was an inconvenience I hadn't planned for," David confirmed. "I was supposed to provide clear cultural guidance based on academic expertise. Instead, I've been mentally short-circuiting every time you entered a room." "And yet your guidance has been valuable despite your mental short-circuiting," Queen Ashara observed. "Your historical frameworks this afternoon actually worked. We made progress that's been stalled for weeks." "I'm glad I could be useful beyond inadvertently insulting you through cultural incompetence," David said. They talked through dinner, food that was excellent and carefully prepared to accommodate both human and Elthari dietary requirements, and David found himself relaxing incrementally as the conversation progressed. Queen Ashara was different in this private setting, less formal, more willing to show humor and genuine curiosity. She asked him about his academic background, how he'd become interested in Elthari culture, what it was like to apply scholarly knowledge to practical diplomacy. "It's terrifying, honestly," David admitted. "Academic study gives you knowledge but not wisdom. I know historical precedents and cultural frameworks, but I don't have the experience to know when those frameworks don't apply to modern situations. Like the eye contact protocols. I was so focused on following what I'd learned that I never questioned whether it might be outdated." "You're being too hard on yourself," Queen Ashara said. "Most of your cultural guidance has been excellent. You just happen to be working from one outdated protocol that coincided with a personal difficulty looking at me directly." "The personal difficulty made the protocol problem worse," David acknowledged. "If I'd been comfortable looking at you, I probably would have noticed that other Elthari weren't following the same protocols and adjusted accordingly. Instead, I was so relieved to have a cultural excuse not to look at you that I never questioned it." "Why does looking at me make you so uncomfortable?" Queen Ashara asked, leaning forward slightly. "You've explained about finding me beautiful, but that can't be the entire explanation. Surely you've encountered beautiful people before without losing your ability to function." David considered how to answer that honestly without making it even more awkward. "It's not just that you're beautiful," he said finally. "It's that you're beautiful and brilliant and powerful, and apparently everyone fears you except me. And I'm terrified that I'm going to say something monumentally stupid that jeopardizes negotiations that matter to both our peoples. Every time I look at you, I'm aware of all those things simultaneously, and my brain just stalls out trying to process it, all while also attempting to provide useful diplomatic input. That's quite a lot to be dealing with while trying to work, Queen Ashara observed, and there was something almost sympathetic in her expression. It's been challenging, David admitted, though marginally less challenging now that I understand I've been following outdated protocols and creating problems that didn't need to exist. The outdated protocols were a symptom, not the cause, Queen Ashara said quietly. She'd finished her wine and was now simply watching him with an intensity that made David hyper-aware of every point of contact between himself and the chair he was sitting in. The cause is that you're attracted to me and don't know what to do with that while maintaining professional boundaries. It wasn't a question, so David didn't try to deny it. Yes, that's an accurate assessment of the situation. I find myself in a similar difficulty, Queen Ashara said, and her voice had gone slightly unsteady in a way that made David's attention focus entirely on her with sudden intensity. I've spent 5 years maintaining absolute control over my emotions and reactions, because showing vulnerability as a queen is dangerous. But you've somehow managed to get past those walls with your terrible confession, and your obvious awkwardness, and your genuine respect for my culture. I find myself wanting to continue these conversations, beyond what diplomatic necessity requires. Your Majesty, David started, then stopped because he had no idea how to finish that sentence. Ashara, Queen Ashara interrupted. In private, I prefer Ashara. The formality is exhausting when I'm not performing sovereignty. Ashara, David repeated, testing her name in his voice and finding it felt both natural and terrifying. I need to be clear about something. I'm not trying to pursue anything inappropriate. I know that any kind of personal relationship between us would be complicated by our respective positions and the ongoing negotiations. I wasn't trying to. I know, Ashara said gently. You were being honest about a difficulty you were experiencing while trying to do your job. That's different from making a pass at me or trying to use personal attraction for diplomatic advantage. She paused. Though I should be clear about my own position, I'm interested in continuing to know you, David. Not because it's diplomatically useful, but because you see me as a person rather than a crown, and that's rare enough to be precious. I don't know how that would work practically, David said carefully. We're from different species, different cultures, and you're literally a sovereign ruler while I'm a junior diplomatic attaché. The power differential alone makes this complicated. Everything about my life is complicated, Ashara replied with a slight smile. Adding one more complication that actually makes me happy seems like a reasonable trade-off. She stood, moving around the table to stand closer to where David sat, and he found himself looking up at her with all his carefully maintained professional distance completely dissolved. I'm not asking you for anything you're not willing to give, and I'm certainly not commanding anything beyond what diplomatic protocol requires. But I am saying that if you're interested in exploring whatever this connection between us is, I'm open to that possibility. Even though it's complicated and potentially problematic, David asked, especially because it's complicated and potentially problematic, Ashara confirmed. Simple and uncomplicated things are easy to dismiss. Complicated and problematic things require genuine engagement and effort, which tends to produce more meaningful results. David stood, which put them close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her eyes. The way her ears tilted forward in what he was learning indicated interest or attention. I'm interested, he admitted. I'm terrified and uncertain about how to navigate this without causing problems, but I'm definitely interested. Then we'll figure it out together, Ashara said, and she was smiling now, genuine and unguarded in a way David suspected few people ever saw. Starting with you getting comfortable looking at me without your brain short-circuiting, because that seems like a foundational skill for whatever comes next. That might take some practice, David warned. I suspect I'll enjoy watching you practice, Ashara replied, and there was something almost playful in her voice that made David realize she was flirting with him, which did absolutely nothing to help his ability to maintain coherent thought. They talked for another hour, ostensibly about cultural protocols and diplomatic frameworks, but really learning about each other in ways that had nothing to do with their professional roles. David learned that Ashara loved history as much as he did, that she painted as a private hobby, that she found court politics exhausting but necessary. Ashara learned that David had originally wanted to be a xenoanthropologist, that he was terrible at most sports but excellent at chess, that he genuinely loved the tedious research that most people found boring. When they finally parted ways late in the evening, David walking back to the human delegation's quarters with his head spinning from wine and conversation, and the surreal reality of having a queen tell him she was interested in him. He had no idea what came next, but for the first time since arriving on Harmony's edge, he was looking forward to finding out. The remaining weeks of negotiations took on a different character after that private dinner. Publicly, David and Queen Ashara maintained perfect professional formality. He provided cultural guidance. She led her delegation through complex territorial discussions. They interacted with appropriate diplomatic courtesy and nothing more. But in private, there were more dinners, more conversations that went beyond protocol into genuine connection, more moments where Ashara let her sovereign mask slip to reveal the person underneath. David found himself fascinated by the complexity of her position and personality. She was simultaneously the ruthless political operator that intelligence reports had described, and someone who genuinely cared about her people's welfare, someone who made hard decisions because they were necessary rather than because they were easy. She had a dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to show it, and she asked questions about human culture with the same analytical curiosity David brought to his study of Elthari society. Ashara, in turn, found David's transparency increasingly endearing. He wore his emotions openly, which was both refreshing and occasionally concerning for someone accustomed to reading subtle political signals. When he was nervous, he talked too much. When he was excited about a historical discovery, he couldn't contain his enthusiasm. When he looked at her with that same overwhelmed expression that had started this whole situation, she felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. The negotiations progressed steadily toward a preliminary peace treaty that both sides could accept. David's cultural frameworks proved genuinely useful, providing diplomatic language that bridged human and Elthari conceptual differences. By the time they reached the final week of talks, the outcome looked promising, not perfect, but a foundation for future cooperation. It was during that final week that Ashara made her surprising proposal, catching David in a quiet corridor after a particularly successful negotiation session. "I have a question for you," she said without preamble. "When these negotiations conclude and you return to human space, what are your plans?" "I'm not sure," David admitted. "Probably return to Earth, debrief with my superiors, maybe write up some academic papers about practical application of cultural protocols. Eventually, I imagine I'll be assigned to another diplomatic mission, though probably not one quite so high stakes as this." "What if you had another option?" Ashara asked carefully. "My court has had a cultural liaison position vacant for several years, someone who can advise on interactions with other species, provide historical context, help navigate cultural differences in diplomatic contexts. The pay is generous, the position comes with significant autonomy, and you'd be based on Aelth Prime at the Imperial Court." David felt his heart rate accelerate. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a position that I genuinely need filled and that you're genuinely qualified for," Ashara said. "But yes, I'm also offering you a way to continue what we've started without the complications of trying to maintain a relationship across species boundaries and political territories." "That's a significant offer," David said, his mind racing through implications. I'd need to discuss it with my superiors, probably negotiate terms with your administration, figure out logistics of human citizenship and Elthari residence. All of which can be arranged if you're interested, Ashara interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to give me an answer today. I'm asking you to consider the possibility. Why? David asked bluntly. I mean, yes, I have relevant expertise, but there must be other qualified candidates who don't come with the complications of being a foreign national you've been. Whatever we've been doing these past weeks. Because you see me as Ashara rather than just Queen Ashara, she said simply. Because you make me laugh and challenge my thinking and don't fear me the way everyone else does. Because having you at court would mean continuing to have someone in my life who values me as a person rather than a political asset. She paused. And yes, because I'm interested in seeing where this connection between us leads, and that's significantly easier if we're in the same planetary system. That's honest, David observed. You set a precedent for honesty with your terrible confession about my beauty being inconvenient, Ashara replied with slight smile. I'm attempting to maintain that precedent. I'll consider it seriously, David promised. Though I have to warn you that having me at your court might cause complications you haven't anticipated. I'm not very good at political intrigue, and I'll probably accidentally offend important people through cultural ignorance. My court could use someone who's bad at intrigue, Ashara said. Everyone else is too good at it. Having someone refreshingly transparent might be valuable precisely because it's unusual. They parted ways with David promising to give her an answer before the negotiations concluded, and him spending the next several days in intense internal debate about whether accepting her offer was incredibly smart or incredibly stupid. He consulted with Ambassador Chen, who was surprisingly supportive of the idea, noting that having a human cultural liaison at the Elthari court could significantly improve long-term diplomatic relations. He messaged his academic advisors on Earth, who were enthusiastically encouraging, seeing this as an unprecedented opportunity for cultural research and practical application. But ultimately, the decision came down to something simpler than professional opportunity or diplomatic utility. Did he want to continue developing this connection with Ashara? Did he want to find out what could grow from a beginning built on awkward confessions and unexpected vulnerability? The answer, David realized, was yes. Absolutely yes. He gave Ashara his answer on the final day of negotiations, in a quiet moment after the preliminary treaty had been formally signed, and both delegations were preparing to depart. I accept your offer, he said simply, with the understanding that there will be logistics to work out, and I'll probably make countless mistakes adjusting to Elthari court life. Ashara's smile was bright and genuine, transforming her face into something radiant. I'm counting on the mistakes. They'll keep things interesting. I make no promises about being interesting in positive ways, David warned. I'll take my chances, Ashara replied. 2 months later, after extensive negotiations between human and Elthari diplomatic services, David found himself arriving on Aelth Prime as the newly appointed cultural liaison to the Imperial Court. Ashara met him personally at the spaceport, which caused considerable stir among the court officials present, and welcomed him formally to her service. Privately, in the quarters that had been prepared for him that were far nicer than anything he'd expected, she welcomed him with less formality. So, she said, standing in his doorway with that same unguarded expression he'd come to recognize as specifically for him. You actually came. I said I would, David replied, though I reserve the right to panic about whether this was a good decision once the reality of living on an alien world and working at an imperial court fully sets in. Panic is understandable, Ashara said. Just try to maintain your ability to look at me while panicking. We've worked hard on that skill. I make no